Hello, my IOP revolves around how Dumont has been affected by stereotypes set by the Europeans and how relevant said stereotypes still are today, all through the lens of postcolonialism. First, I will be talking about the history of these stereotypes, where and how they began, as well as their prominence in today's world. Dumont brings up a supposed horse culture quite a few times throughout many of her poems. While not technically being false in the grand spectrum, said horse culture does not encompass anywhere near the entire population of Aboriginals living in North America. With many cultures revolving around the oceans and living in different geographical areas, horses either were not an option at all or simply not a reasonable or viable one. Another point is that horses are not even native to North America and were brought here by the Europeans. While the title horse culture by definition speaks of only the Aboriginals of the Great Plains, the way it is used as a stereotype, it more closely encompasses all of the Aboriginals of North America. Although the Aboriginals are considered a horse culture, they are not the only example. Other examples, such as the Mongolians and the Scythians, help to show just how wrong the stereotype is. By stating all the Aboriginals are as a generic horse culture, you are disregarding said other horse-based civilizations. The definition also explains that these cultures are generally nomadic by nature and tend to be foraging based. Dumont also speaks of bison a number of times. Bison are a staple in Aboriginal cultures but have also become a stereotype in the same way that the homogenizing horse culture has. While a great number of Aboriginals did rely on bison to be a substantial part of their diets, a large sum of tribes and cultures did not. All the cultures that relied on bison hunted them in separate times of the year, which helped keep their populations stable. Bison hunting was generally a communal effort and resulted in a mass amount of meat from the animals. Next, I will explain some of the meanings and symbolism that Dumont uses within her poems, while using these stereotypes and her overarching goal of using them. Stereotypes are used quite freely throughout Dumont's poems. She not only uses the stereotypes to emphasize their points, but also to allow the reader to focus on them and question them, like bringing them into the spotlight per se. The lens of post-colonialism is prominent in all of Dumont's poems, but the title White Noise for one of her collections is a lot more than unite the poems involved. The title itself is Dumont stating her agenda and goal for the collection. In a mere 2 words, Dumont makes her opinion quite clear. The title speaks of the government shutting out the Métis and Aboriginal voices with their own, thus being a white noise. This ties more into post-colonialism as a whole rather than directly into stereotypes, but overall those 2 words tend to go hand in hand, due to imperialism being the cause of the Western expansion, and eventually the direct destruction of the Aboriginal culture and formation of stereotypes. Another collection title is Made of Water. Dumont named the entire collection very similar to the final poem in the collection. The name speaks of their culture being nomadic and down to earth. All of the cultures and tribes within the Aboriginals of Northern America did live off the land and respect it as much as they could. Although this is a stereotype by definition, it is definitely not false. Dumont's poems within the collection all have fairly similar titles, which helps to surface a general theme of the Aboriginals' way of living off the land. The poems' titles also matter in the fact that they help to bring the collection's title to life and support it. In Made of Water, the poems' titles such as Liquid Prairie and Fireflies and We Are Made of Water greatly help to support the unifying title and overall achieve the goal of keeping a generally consistent theme. While the other titles in the collection do help support the theme, they are not as direct as the ones mentioned and overall connect in a lesser way. Dumont uses the titles of her poems to unify the poem, and titles of her collections to unify all the poems included. By doing so, she helps the reader to connect the poems together. Post-colonialism is also a grand topic in not only Dumont's work, but quite a few other poets and writers use it to show and also empower their opinion on a stated topic. While Dumont uses it to show her Métis side, other writers such as Gregory Schofield use it to reveal the horrors the westernization has caused the Aboriginals as a whole, and Eileen Myles uses it to reject societal norms. Another great poem that is completely based on stereotyping is known as How to Write the Great American Indian Novel by Sherman Alexie. Within the first line, it immediately begins with the stereotyping that states, all the Indians must have tragic features, then mentions some of said needed features. By starting the poem this way, he sets the stage for the entire basis and goal of the poem, and what he desires to achieve with it. The hero must be half-breed, he starts. The next stanza with a claim of how all portrayals of natives in films and books have somehow made a connection with one another, and generally have all the same stereotypes used. Sherman also uses stereotypes within stereotypes to help add depth to his poem through him stating that blue veins running through her skin like rivers. While the entire poem is essentially a stereotype, this stanza links the popular idea of Aboriginals being connected to the land and respecting it. This is not the only time Sherman mentions something along the lines of the land. She would be compared to nature: brown hills, mountains, fertile valleys, dewy grass, wind, and clear water, which he uses to help enforce the depth of his poem. Sherman goes on to talking about how it is always based on a horse culture, which helps enforce the point I mentioned before, how the stereotype is that natives are all encompassed within the term horse culture. The final stanza of the poem is quite powerful when the time is taken to interpret it. In the great American Indian novel, when it is finally written, all of the white people will be Indians and all of the Indians will be ghosts. By saying this, he means that in the end, all of the supposed natives in the story are not actually represented correctly, and in a film, they are played by somebody who is not Aboriginal. And the actual Aboriginals in the fiction seemingly don't exist. The next topic is developed around how the modern society sees Native people and how our movies, books, and etc. have shaped our vision. For over 100 years, westerns and documentaries have shaped the public's perception of Native people. Lots of directors and writers portray Aboriginals in their films and books, but generally speaking is a stereotype nature, and it tends to be offensive in one way or another. Hollywood's versions and representations of Aboriginals always showed them to be either wiped out or rained on. There is no middle ground. Any fiction that displays a Western expansion or how the West was won is always representing Aboriginals in a more racist and objective way. Generally, Aboriginal people are portrayed as primitive and either violent and devious or passive and submissive. And in everyday lives, the average person has grown accustomed to this to the extent that they see Aboriginals in that way, whether they actually know someone with Native background or not. Perhaps the most destructive to the image of Aboriginals is the lack of personality and character given to them by the media. Mostly cast as only supporting roles when to be taken seriously, or even worse, when they are casted as or represented as a complete joke. They are also cast as background characters or filler, and never allowed to actually develop and show the complexity of themselves. Most stories involving natives is written and voiced in a European experience, which aids in the stereotyping and neglect of the Aboriginal culture. No Aboriginal is allowed to explore themselves or show any strengths or weaknesses of being human, essentially being depicted as robotic by nature and not having a very curved character arc, basically flat. Overall, Dumont, along with a vast number of other poets and writers, used post-colonialism as a way of highlighting their main topics and themes. Post-colonialism is not generally one straight definition or topic. While being a largely flexible theme, it is quite clear when used in any way imaginable. Dumont uses it to enhance her opinions as a Métis and how the government has affected her and her lifestyle. Through her broad and abundant use of stereotypes, it is quite clear she is portraying a message of strength through her direct denial and rebellion against said stereotypes as they are still prominent in today's society.